17 women were hired to clean one house. 16 of them left in the middle of the night and never spoke of it again. The 17th didn't run. She recorded everything. For 11 years, a billionaire named Marcus Whitfield hired housekeeper after housekeeper for his estate in the mountains outside Asheville, North Carolina. Each one signed a contract promising more money than most people make in 3 years of ordinary work. Each one moved into a 40-room mansion with marble floors, a private chef's kitchen, and a wing of the house they were told, on their very first day, never to enter after dark. Most of them lasted a few months. Some lasted a few weeks. 3 of them didn't just quit. They vanished. No goodbye texts to family. No forwarding address. No trace in any bank record or phone log that anyone could ever find again. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what was waiting behind that locked door on the second floor. You will understand why a man worth over $2 billion spent more than a decade, and by some estimates close to $40 million, making absolutely certain that no one ever found out. And you will meet the one woman who looked at all that money and said no. Before we get into it, subscribe now, because what Dana Pierce found in that hallway is something you will not see coming. This is the story of Ravenscroft Hall, a 40-room estate built into the hills outside Asheville, surrounded by 8-foot iron gates, a private security detail, and rules that most people would never accept just to earn a paycheck. At the center of it is Marcus Whitfield, a man who built a private pharmaceutical logistics empire from a single warehouse into a business worth billions, and who has not given a single face-to-face interview in over 9 years. At the edge of it is Dana Pierce, a single mother from Knoxville who took a live-in housekeeping job because the salary alone would clear every debt she had within a year. And between them is the house itself. 40 rooms. One hallway no employee is permitted to walk down after 9 o'clock at night. And a question that 17 different women were paid, in one form or another, never to answer out loud. Why does every housekeeper leave within 4 months? What has Marcus Whitfield spent a fortune making sure the world never sees? And what did Dana Pierce find that made her the only one who refused to take the money and disappear quietly like the rest? Stay with this one to the end, because the answer is not what almost anyone who has heard fragments of this story assumes it to be. To understand what happened inside Ravenscroft Hall, you first have to understand the man who built it and the woman he built it for. Marcus Whitfield grew up in Gastonia, North Carolina, the only son of a pharmacist who ran a single independent drugstore on a two-lane road for 30 years. That drugstore did not survive Marcus's teenage years. A bad supply partnership, a chain competitor undercutting prices 2 blocks away, and a bank that called in a loan at the worst possible moment together took everything his father had built in less than 18 months. Marcus was 16 when he watched his father hand the store keys to a landlord for the last time. People who knew the family at the time describe a boy who did not cry, did not rage, but who seemed, from that point forward, to trust systems and contracts far more than he trusted people. By 26, Marcus had taken a small inheritance, a business degree, and a stubborn refusal to ever again be at the mercy of a single point of failure, and built the earliest version of Whitfield Logistics Group out of one rented warehouse. The business specialized in something unglamorous but essential: the transport and storage of temperature-sensitive medications, insulin, vaccines, specialty biologics that could spoil or lose potency if a single link in the supply chain failed. In an industry where one bad shipment could cost a regional hospital system millions of dollars and, in the worst cases, human lives, Marcus built a reputation for redundancy so obsessive that competitors joked he had backup generators for his backup generators. Within 15 years, Whitfield Logistics Group controlled nearly a quarter of the cold chain pharmaceutical market across the Southeast. Marcus Whitfield had become, almost without the broader public noticing, a billionaire. Former employees from those early years describe him consistently: brilliant, demanding, almost pathologically private. He rarely gave interviews even at the peak of his company's visibility, and when he did, he answered questions about logistics contracts in exhaustive detail while deflecting every personal question with practiced ease. He was known to personally review security clauses in vendor contracts line by line, a habit several former executives attributed directly to the loss of his father's business. He trusted contracts. He trusted redundancy. He did not, by most accounts, trust people easily. At 31, that changed, at least in one respect. Marcus married Elena Marchetti, a former intensive care nurse he met under circumstances that, ironically, traced directly back to his own business. A cold chain failure at a regional hospital system had put a batch of critical medication at risk of spoiling during a multi-day ice storm, and Elena had been one of the nurses working around the clock to manage patients while the crisis was resolved. Marcus, by his own account given years later in a rare deposition, had come to the hospital personally to oversee the emergency resupply, and it was there, in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, that he met the one person who would eventually get him to leave his own office before midnight. Friends of the couple, several of whom would later be contacted once this story became public, described the marriage as quiet but genuine. Elena Whitfield rarely appeared at galas or industry fundraisers, preferring evenings at the estate over public appearances. She kept, according to one former neighbor, an almost stubborn independence within the marriage, insisting on maintaining her own small sailboat on nearby Lake Lure and taking it out most weekends, alone, as a way of decompressing from a life that had otherwise become defined by her husband's growing empire. 9 years ago, on a warm evening in late July, that independence would define the next decade of both their lives. Elena took her sailboat out onto Lake Lure in the late afternoon, as she had done hundreds of times before. A storm system that regional forecasters had projected to stay well south of the lake instead intensified and shifted north with almost no warning. By the time search and rescue vessels reached the area, visibility was down to a few dozen feet, and the lake's surface was churning hard enough that even experienced rescue divers described the conditions as some of the worst they had worked in. The boat was recovered the next morning, capsized and partially submerged near the lake's northern shore. Elena Whitfield's body was never recovered. Those who knew the couple well in the years before the accident often pointed to one particular habit as evidence of how deeply the marriage had shaped Marcus, a man otherwise defined almost entirely by his work. Every Sunday evening, without fail, Marcus closed his laptop by 6 o'clock, an act his own executives described as nothing short of remarkable given his usual habits, and the couple ate dinner together on the back terrace regardless of season, a standing tradition Elena had insisted on from the earliest months of their marriage. A former estate manager who worked at Ravenscroft Hall during that period recalled that Marcus kept a single framed photograph on his desk at all times, not a portrait, but a candid shot of Elena laughing mid-sentence at their wedding reception, and that he was known to glance at it during even the most contentious business calls, as though it steadied him. It is against this backdrop that the events of that July evening became, for Marcus, not simply a tragedy, but something closer to an unraveling. Search and rescue crews would later tell investigators that the storm's sudden intensification had caught even experienced lake residents off guard that night, with wind gusts reported well above what the region typically saw outside of a named tropical system. Marcus, alerted by a neighbor who noticed the empty boat slip after dark, reportedly attempted to take a motorboat out onto the lake himself before security personnel physically stopped him, a detail confirmed years later by 2 separate former employees present that night. There was a search that lasted, officially, 11 days. There was a small, private memorial service that made regional papers for exactly one news cycle before the story faded, as these stories do, into the background of daily headlines. And then Marcus Whitfield disappeared almost entirely from public view for nearly 2 years. When he eventually re-emerged, The changes were immediately noticeable to anyone who had worked closely with him before. He sold 2 of his company's 3 regional offices and restructured the business to be run almost entirely from Ravenscroft Hall, communicating with executives by video call rather than in person. He hired a private security team larger than the one that had protected the estate before. And, according to former staff who spoke about the period only after Dana's story became public, he began hiring live-in housekeepers at a pace that struck almost everyone who worked at the estate as unusual. Not because housekeepers were hired at all, but because, from that point forward, none of them seemed to stay. This is where Dana Pierce enters the story. Dana was 34 years old, recently divorced, raising an 8-year-old son named Caleb largely on her own in Knoxville, when she came across the listing on a private domestic staffing website her sister had recommended. Live-in housekeeper, Ravenscroft Hall, $12,000 a month, room and board included, 1 weekend off per month to visit family. For a woman working 2 service jobs simultaneously just to keep her small apartment's lights on and her son in the same school district, it read like a number that couldn't possibly be real. Dana was not, by the account of nearly everyone who has since spoken publicly or privately about her, a nervous or easily rattled person. She had spent 3 years working overnight shifts in a hospital cafeteria while her marriage was ending, learning to function on broken sleep and to keep a level head during chaotic, understaffed nights. She had lived alone in a small apartment for the better part of 3 years afterward without ever once complaining about strange noises in the walls or shadows in an unfamiliar hallway. Those who knew her before Ravenscroft Hall describe her as practical almost to a fault, the kind of person who would investigate a strange sound rather than pack a bag and leave over it. That single character trait would end up mattering enormously for everything that followed, because it meant that when Dana Pierce eventually said, publicly and on the record, that something was deeply wrong inside that house, almost no one who had ever known her found it easy to dismiss her as an overly imaginative woman who had simply spooked herself in an unfamiliar mansion. On her very first day at Ravenscroft Hall, as she carried her single-worn suitcase up the front steps beneath a portico that alone was larger than her entire Knoxville apartment, the outgoing housekeeper stopped her at the door. The woman was in her 50s, and she would not fully meet Dana's eyes as she spoke. "Don't go up the east stairs after 9, she said. "Just don't." Dana asked why. The outgoing housekeeper was already halfway to her car, a single suitcase of her own in hand, and she did not turn around to answer. Dana thought about that woman often during her first weeks at the estate. She never learned her name, only that she had lasted, according to a scrap of paper Dana would later find, almost exactly 3.5 months. She wondered, in those early days, whether the woman had simply been superstitious, the kind of person who invents a haunted corner of any large old house out of nervous habit. It was an easy thing to believe, standing in the estate's bright, sunlit entrance hall on a Tuesday morning with fresh coffee in hand and a groundskeeper mowing the front lawn in full view of the windows. It became considerably harder to believe as the weeks wore on. Dana had brought exactly 1 photograph with her to Ravenscroft Hall, a picture of her son Caleb at his 8th birthday party, missing his front tooth and grinning anyway, and she kept it propped against the small lamp on her nightstand in the staff quarters. She called him every night at 7, after his homework and before his bath, a ritual neither of them had missed once in 4 months, and it was during these calls, more than any other part of her day, that she felt most like herself rather than like an employee of a house that seemed to hold its breath after dark. She would tell him about the deer that wandered near the tree line at dusk, about Antoine's elaborate Sunday dinners, about anything except the parts of the house she was already beginning to keep private even from her own son. For the first several weeks, Dana settled into a routine that, on paper, looked almost enviable compared to anything she had worked before. She managed the day-to-day running of a house far larger than any private residence she had ever set foot in, coordinating with a private chef named Antoine, a groundskeeper who lived in a small cottage near the estate's back gate, and a rotating security detail that patrolled the perimeter around the clock but almost never entered the residence itself. Marcus Whitfield kept largely to a ground-floor study, conducting video calls with logistics executives late into the evening, rarely surfacing before noon and rarely engaging in more than a brief, polite exchange of instructions with Dana each day. It was the small details that began to accumulate first, the way small details always do in a house that is hiding something far larger than any single detail could explain. Every morning, Dana prepared 2 breakfast trays. One went to Mr. Whitfield's study, delivered by Dana herself. The second, she was told during her very first week, went upstairs, and she was never, under any circumstance, to carry it there herself. A member of the private nursing staff, a woman in her 60s named Carol Nesbitt who lived off the estate and arrived promptly at 7 every morning regardless of weather, always intercepted that second tray at the base of the east staircase and carried it up alone. Dana never once saw that tray return to the kitchen empty, and she never saw it return to the kitchen at all in her presence. Clean dishes, washed and stacked, simply reappeared on the kitchen counter each following morning, as though some part of the household's routine happened entirely outside the hours she was present to observe it. Doing laundry during her second month, sorting through a hamper the head housekeeping supervisor had directed her to without further explanation, Dana found clothing in a size and style that matched no resident of Ravenscroft Hall she had ever met or even heard mentioned. Soft cotton nightgowns, worn house slippers, the kind sold in bulk at pharmacy chains rather than the designer labels that filled every other closet in the house. Cardigans in muted, practical colors, entirely at odds with the tailored wardrobe Marcus Whitfield wore even around the estate. All of it laundered on a separate cycle from the household's other linens, and all of it returned, again, through Carol, without a single word of explanation offered or, apparently, expected. Dana raised the subject once, carefully, with the head of housekeeping staff who had originally trained her during her first week, a woman named Renata who had worked at Ravenscroft Hall longer than anyone else on the domestic staff, nearly 6 years by that point. Renata's answer, delivered without looking up from the linen closet she was reorganizing, was short and final. "That's not something we ask about here. That's not something anyone here has ever asked about, not if they wanted to keep working." At night, in the staff quarters on the west side of the house, well away from the sealed eastern wing, Dana began to hear footsteps. Not every night, not even most nights, but often enough, over the following weeks, that she began keeping a private mental log of the dates and approximate times, the way a person instinctively does when some part of them suspects they may need to explain themselves credibly later to someone about something. The footsteps always seemed to originate from directly above the sealed east wing, the one section of the house she had been warned on her very first day never to enter after 9 o'clock at night. When she mentioned the footsteps once, in what she tried to make sound like a casual comment, to the head of the security detail during an early morning coffee in the kitchen, the man answered without looking up from his mug that the house had old plumbing, and old plumbing made old house noises at night. Dana let the subject drop, for a time, because she genuinely needed this job, and because $800 a week, delivered reliably every Friday, does a great deal to quiet a working mother's private doubts about her employer's stranger habits. There was, too, a smaller and stranger detail that Dana would only fully understand the significance of much later. Once a month, without fail, a florist's delivery van arrived at the estate's back service entrance, always on a Wednesday, always carrying the same modest arrangement of white lilies and blue hydrangeas. Dana was instructed to sign for the delivery herself, but never to unwrap it. Carol collected the flowers directly from the kitchen counter within the hour, and Dana never saw so much as a stem of them anywhere else in the house, not in Marcus Whitfield's study, not in any of the public sitting rooms, not in the dining room, where he took most of his meals alone. She assumed, for months, that they were simply a standing order for some part of the house she wasn't shown. It did not occur to her until much later that blue hydrangeas had been. According to an old wedding photograph she once glimpsed briefly in a hallway she was cleaning, the exact flower Elena Whitfield had carried down the aisle on her wedding day. By her third month, Dana had also begun to notice the peculiar rhythm of Marcus Whitfield's own moods, one that seemed to track, almost too closely to be coincidence, with a specific date each July. In the days surrounding the anniversary of the boating accident that had supposedly taken his wife's life, Whitfield became noticeably withdrawn even by his own reserved standards, canceling video calls with executives, taking his meals later and later into the evening, and, on one occasion Dana happened to witness from the kitchen window, standing motionless on the back terrace for nearly 40 minutes in the rain without an umbrella, looking toward the tree line in the direction of the lake, though the lake itself was well out of sight from the house. She asked Antoine, the private chef, about it once, carefully, over the quiet clatter of dinner preparation. Antoine had worked at the estate for 8 years, longer even than Renata, and his answer was the closest thing to a real warning anyone at Ravenscroft Hall had offered Dana since her very first day. "Mr. Whitfield carries something heavier than money," he told her, not looking up from the pot he was stirring. "Don't go looking for what it is. The ones who look always leave, one way or another." Dana asked him if he meant the housekeepers who quit. Antoine did not answer that question at all, and he never brought the subject up again. But doubt has a way of compounding inside a house like Ravenscroft Hall, especially for a woman as observant and unhurried in her judgments as Dana Pierce. And by her 4th month at the estate, she had begun paying far closer attention than any housekeeper before her seemingly had. She began to notice, first, that the previous housekeepers whose names she occasionally found scrawled in old shift logs, left behind in a supply closet no one had cleaned out in years, averaged just under 4 months of employment before their names simply stopped appearing in any record at all. Not fired outright, as far as the paperwork suggested. Not laid off for any stated business reason. The entries in the logs simply ended, and every single one of them ended with an identical final note, written in the same looping handwriting each time. Final settlement processed. She began to notice, second, that whenever a new housekeeper's questions about the second floor grew a little too pointed, that housekeeper would, within days, have a private meeting scheduled with a man Dana had not yet met herself, a lawyer based out of Charlotte who visited the estate on an unpredictable schedule that nonetheless seemed, every single time according to the old logs, to follow closely on the heels of a housekeeper's curiosity reaching its peak. And then, in her 4th month, cleaning beneath a heavy oak drawer in an unused guest bedroom that had clearly not been disturbed by human hands in years, Dana found a small brass key taped carefully to the underside of the wood. A single letter had been scratched crudely into the head of the key with something sharp, a nail file or the tip of a knife. The letter was E. That night, for the first time since arriving at Ravenscroft Hall 4 months earlier, Dana Pierce did not go to sleep. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the staff quarters with that small brass key resting in her open palm until well past 1 in the morning, turning over, one by one, every strange detail she had accumulated across 4 months. The second tray that never came back down empty, the unexplained clothing laundered in secret, the footsteps overhead that were somehow always old plumbing. The 16 other names in the old shift logs that simply stopped appearing, always with the same 4 words, attached to their final entry. She made a decision that night that none of the 16 housekeepers before her, at least as far as any surviving record suggested, had ever made. She decided she was going to find out, for herself and on her own terms, exactly what that small brass key was meant to open. Before we follow Dana up that staircase, It's worth understanding just how deliberately the pattern before her had been constructed, because what she was about to walk into was not the product of one man's private paranoia acting alone. It was the product of a system, refined and quietly perfected over 11 years, built specifically to ensure that no housekeeper ever got as far as Dana was now determined to go. Former staff who eventually agreed to speak, always under conditions of strict anonymity, about their time at Ravenscroft Hall, described a remarkably consistent progression, one that repeated itself with almost mechanical regularity across more than a decade. A new housekeeper would be hired, background checked extensively, and given the same brief warning on her first day about the east staircase. For the first several weeks, everything would proceed entirely normally. Then, almost without exception, that housekeeper would begin to notice the very same details Dana had noticed in her own first 4 months. The second breakfast tray, the unexplained laundry, the footsteps that arrived only after dark. Within days of that curiosity becoming visible in even the smallest way, a question asked at the wrong moment, a lingering glance held a beat too long toward the east staircase, the housekeeper in question would find herself summoned to a private meeting. Not with Marcus Whitfield himself, who by every account almost never engaged directly with domestic staff matters, but with his longtime personal attorney, a man named Gerald Combs, who according to internal documents later reviewed during the eventual guardianship proceeding handled what those documents described only as estate sensitivity matters. The meetings, according to 2 former employees willing to describe them in general terms without violating the settlements they had already accepted, followed an almost scripted pattern each time, one so consistent it suggested years of careful refinement. Combs would explain, calmly and without emotion, that the housekeeper's employment was being terminated effective immediately for reasons entirely unrelated to the quality of her work. He would then present a settlement agreement, sums ranging by different former employees' accounts anywhere from $80,000 to well over $200,000, depending on how far along a given housekeeper's suspicions had progressed, contingent on the immediate signing of an extraordinarily broad non-disclosure agreement, one that covered not merely the terms of the settlement itself, but any and all details whatsoever about daily life inside Ravenscroft Hall, past, present, or future. 14 of the 17 housekeepers who passed through the estate over those 11 years took that deal without significant resistance, packed their belongings within 24 hours as the agreements required, and were never heard from again in any public connection to the house or its owner. The 3 who did not simply accept a standard settlement are the ones investigators, journalists, and eventually Dana herself would find most difficult to trace at all once the broader story became public. Public record searches conducted in the weeks after Dana's story broke turned up no forwarding addresses, no continued employment history under any known name, and no ongoing social media activity past a certain sharply defined date for any of the 3 women. It was this single detail, more than any other piece of the 11-year pattern, that fueled the darkest public theories circulating online in the days before the full truth emerged, theories involving violence, a hidden burial site somewhere across the estate's 11 wooded acres, or something considerably worse than a large settlement check and a signature on a legal document. It's worth pausing here to say plainly, ahead of where this story eventually leads, those darker theories, while entirely understandable given the pattern on its surface, turned out to be wrong. What Dana was about to discover behind that locked door was not evidence of murder, and it was not evidence of any hidden crime in the conventional sense at all. But it was, in its own way, just as difficult for the public to fully sit with once the complete truth eventually came out, precisely because the truth complicated the simple villain that the surface pattern seemed, for 11 years, to promise. Rumors passed among former staff varied wildly in the years leading up to Dana's own discovery. Some believed Whitfield was concealing an illegal pharmaceutical storage operation somewhere within the estate itself, a direct and almost poetic violation of the very regulations his own company had built its reputation on complying with meticulously. Others believed there was a hidden vault built somewhere beneath the sealed East Wing, and that the footsteps former staff described hearing were nothing more than an automated security or climate control system moving through otherwise empty rooms on a scheduled cycle. One former housekeeper, in an account given anonymously years after her own departure, claimed she had glimpsed a pale, unmoving figure standing at the top of the east staircase late one night, and had given her notice within the week, only half-jokingly telling a friend afterward that she was fairly certain the house itself was haunted. Every one of these theories, we now understand with the benefit of hindsight, was reaching blindly toward the same underlying truth from a slightly different angle, without any single former employee ever quite managing to arrive at the full picture on their own. There were, in addition to the 14 settled departures and the 3 untraceable ones, smaller pieces of the pattern that only came fully into focus later. A private investigator, hired at one point through a shell company traced back to Gerald Combs's law firm, had spent nearly 3 months monitoring the movements of a former housekeeper who had relocated out of state after her own settlement, apparently to confirm she was honoring the terms of her non-disclosure agreement rather than speaking to journalists who had, even then, occasionally sniffed around the edges of the Ravenscroft Hall story without ever breaking it open. A regional true crime blogger had, for years before Dana ever arrived, published a single speculative post about the mansion with the revolving door of housekeepers, only to quietly take the post down within a week after what she later described, vaguely and without further detail, as a very polite and very well-funded conversation with representatives of Whitfield Logistics Group. One former housekeeper's account, given years after her own departure, and only on the condition that her real name never be used in any retelling of this story, described the moment her own curiosity crossed whatever invisible line the estate's system was built to detect. She had, she said, simply asked Carol in passing one morning whether the second breakfast tray was for a family member recovering from an illness, phrased as nothing more than polite small talk between 2 women who crossed paths in the kitchen most days. Carol had not answered. Within 48 hours, that housekeeper was seated across from Gerald Combs in a small office she had never been shown before, being told her employment had ended and a settlement was already prepared for her signature. She recalled being struck, even in the disorientation of the moment, by how quickly and completely the offer had been assembled, as though it had been sitting ready in a drawer for exactly this purpose the entire time she had worked there. A second former employee, who had worked at Ravenscroft Hall roughly 4 years before Dana ever arrived, offered a very different account when she finally agreed to speak, one shaped less by fear than by a kind of lingering guilt she said she had carried for years. She described herself, at the time, as newly arrived from overseas on a work visa tied directly to her employment at the estate, a detail she believed the household had specifically sought out when hiring her. She said she understood, without ever being told outright, that raising any question about the second floor could jeopardize not just her job, but her ability to remain in the country at all. She never went near the east staircase after dark, not once in the 11 months she worked there, not because she wasn't curious, she said, but because she couldn't afford to be. She left Ravenscroft Hall on good terms, with a modest bonus rather than a full settlement, having never technically discovered anything the household needed to silence. She said, looking back, that she had always assumed something was being hidden. She simply decided it wasn't her business to find out, and for years afterward, she wondered whether that decision made her complicit in something she never fully understood. A third account came from a woman who had lasted barely 6 weeks at the estate, one of the shortest tenures in its 11-year history, and who described her departure not as a negotiated settlement at all, but as something closer to a quiet dismissal before her curiosity had even fully formed. She recalled being reassigned, without explanation, away from any cleaning duties on the second floor within her first 10 days, and being told by Renata that certain staff simply weren't suited to the East Wing schedule. She left of her own accord shortly afterward, unsettled less by anything she had seen than by how carefully she seemed to be managed even before she had asked a single question. Her account, more than any other, suggested to investigators later that the household system for containing curiosity had grown so refined by that point that it had begun intervening preemptively, identifying housekeepers it judged too perceptive before they ever got close enough to the truth to require a formal settlement at all. Taken together, these accounts painted a picture considerably more elaborate than a single locked door and a nervous nurse. They described a household that had, over more than a decade, developed something close to an early warning system for its own greatest secret, one sensitive enough to flag a passing question in a kitchen, a lingering glance toward a staircase, or simply a new employee's temperament, long before that employee ever came within sight of the truth itself. A fourth account, perhaps the most unsettling of all once the full truth eventually came to light, came from a woman who had worked at Ravenscroft Hall roughly 7 years before Dana, during what former staff describe as the estate's most secretive period, in the years immediately following Elena's supposed death, when Marcus himself was still largely absent from public life. This particular housekeeper recalled being instructed, on more than one occasion, to leave a full breakfast tray at the base of the east staircase, and then leave the immediate area entirely for no less than 20 minutes before returning, an instruction she followed without question at the time, assuming it was simply an eccentric household preference of the kind wealthy employers sometimes insisted on. She recalled, too, being struck by how much food came back on that tray compared to how little seemed eaten, and by a single detail she had never mentioned to anyone until she was interviewed years later, that the tray, on more than one occasion, came back with a few strands of long, dark hair caught in the folded napkin, hair that did not match her own or, as far as she knew, anyone else's on the household staff at the time. She said she had noticed it, filed it away as strange, and moved on with her day, the way people do with small details that don't yet have anywhere to fit. Taken as a whole, these 4 accounts, along with the smaller details Dana herself had already gathered independently over 4 months, formed a portrait of an 11-year operation so quietly thorough that it very nearly succeeded in outlasting every single person who ever came close to understanding it. What finally broke the pattern was not a whistleblower with evidence to sell, not a journalist chasing a tip, but simply one housekeeper who happened to be, by nature and by circumstance, more patient and less easily frightened than the 16 who came before her. A second former employee, one of the small number who worked groundskeeping rather than domestic staff, described a different piece of the pattern entirely. He recalled being instructed, twice a year, to reinforce a section of decorative hedging along the estate's eastern exterior wall, specifically beneath the sealed wing's windows, tall enough that no one standing at ground level could ever see into those particular rooms even briefly during pruning season. He had never questioned the instruction at the time, assuming it was simple aesthetic preference on the part of a wealthy client. It was only years later, reading early news coverage of Dana's discovery, that he understood exactly what he had spent a decade helping to conceal without ever knowing it. None of this, Dana would later say, was known to her in any detail as she stood outside that sealed hallway with the small brass key in her hand. She knew only what 4 months of careful observation had shown her directly, and what a handful of old shift logs, left behind by carelessness rather than design, had quietly confirmed. The night Dana found the brass key marked with the letter E, she did not go immediately to Gerald Combs's office, as at least one former housekeeper reportedly had, hoping to negotiate a settlement before her curiosity became too dangerous to ignore. She did not confront Carol Nesbitt directly, either, unwilling to tip her hand before she had seen the truth for herself. Instead, she waited 3 additional nights, quietly observing Carol's morning and evening routine with the sort of patient, methodical attention that had made her so difficult for the estate's usual process to manage in the first place, until she understood precisely which narrow window of hours the East Wing was left entirely unattended between the nurse's morning arrival and her evening departure. On the 4th night, just after 9 o'clock exactly, the precise hour she had been warned against on her very first day at Ravenscroft Hall, Dana Pierce climbed the east staircase alone, the small brass key held tightly enough in her closed fist that it would leave a faint mark in her palm the following morning. The hallway at the top of the east staircase was unlike anything else in Ravenscroft Hall, where the rest of the house was bright and high-ceilinged, filled with the sort of carefully curated art a decorator selects specifically for a billionaire's public rooms. This hallway was quiet in an entirely different, more deliberate way. The carpet underfoot was thick enough to muffle every footstep almost completely. A single low lamp near the far end provided the only light, and at the very end of that hallway stood one door, fitted with a brass lock that matched, precisely, the small key Dana now held. She would tell a close friend, weeks later, that she stood outside that door for nearly 10 full minutes before she could make herself finally turn the key in the lock. What waited inside was not what 11 years of rumor, speculation, and increasingly dark online theorizing had prepared anyone, including Dana herself, to expect. It was not a hidden storage vault for illegal pharmaceutical shipments. It was not physical evidence of any crime actively in progress. It was, instead, a fully furnished private suite, a small sitting room opening into a bedroom, soft warm lighting throughout, a well-stocked bookshelf along one wall, a television permanently tuned to a nature documentary channel with the volume kept low, and, seated in a comfortable chair position beside the room's single window, a woman Dana did not fully recognize at first, because 9 years of old newspaper photographs had done nothing to prepare her for what 9 years and a severe accident had actually done to that woman's face and bearing. The woman looked up slowly when the door opened. She did not appear frightened by Dana's sudden presence. She appeared, more than anything else, tired in a way that went far beyond the tiredness of a single sleepless night, the kind of exhaustion that settles into a person only after years spent in the same small handful of rooms. Dana would later describe this exact moment, more than any other in the entire story, as the one that changed everything for her personally. Not fear at what she'd found, but a sudden and unexpected wave of grief for a stranger she had not, until that instant, known existed at all. The private nurse, Carol Nesbitt, arrived within minutes, having been alerted the moment a motion sensor installed along the sealed hallway triggered well outside its scheduled hours. She did not scream, and she did not panic, or even raise her voice. She simply guided Dana firmly but gently into the room's small sitting area, and, for the first time in the 11-year history of the estate's revolving door of housekeepers, someone employed at Ravenscroft Hall finally told the complete truth to a member of the household staff, instead of quietly preparing a settlement offer. The woman seated by the window was Elena Whitfield. She had not died on Lake Lure 9 years earlier, as the entire world, including her own extended family, had been led to believe. She had survived the capsizing of her small sailboat that stormy July evening, though barely, pulled unconscious from the churning water hours later by a passing fisherman who had ignored the storm warnings himself in order to reach his own dock before nightfall. The accident left her with a severe traumatic brain injury, extensive and permanently disfiguring facial scarring from being repeatedly struck against the overturned hull, and a resulting cognitive and psychological decline that had left her, across the 9 years since, largely nonverbal, and entirely dependent on continuous, specialized medical care. Marcus Whitfield, according to Carol's careful, measured account that night, had made a decision in the earliest and most desperate days of Elena's uncertain recovery that would go on to define the next decade of both of their lives. Faced with a wife who would very likely never again resemble, in any way the wider world would recognize, the woman whose photograph still hung in the Whitfield Logistics Group corporate offices, and who, given the documented severity of her ongoing condition, might require a formal legal guardianship arrangement that could, under North Carolina law at the time, potentially expose significant company assets to claims from Elena's own extended family, given her minority ownership stake in the business from its earliest founding years. Marcus made the choice to instead tell the entire world that his wife had died. He arranged a small, deliberately private, closed-casket memorial service. He quietly transferred Elena, once she was medically stable enough to be moved, into a specially sealed private suite within his own home, staffed around the clock by a single deeply trusted nurse operating under an extraordinarily generous confidentiality contract of her own. And for 9 consecutive years, he maintained the public fiction that Elena Whitfield was gone entirely, rather than let the wider world, or, as Carol suggested to Dana more than once that night, Elena's own long-estranged younger sister, ever see firsthand what 9 years and one storm had actually done to her. Every single housekeeper who came close, over those 11 years, to discovering any part of this truth was not silenced through threats or intimidation, at least not initially, and not by Marcus's direct instruction. They were paid, extravagantly by almost any reasonable standard, to disappear quietly into new lives elsewhere, under legal agreements so favorable financially that challenging them afterward would have been ruinously expensive for almost anyone to attempt. The 3 whose trails went cold entirely, it would later emerge during the guardianship proceeding, had simply taken their settlement money and relocated overseas voluntarily, choosing complete personal anonymity over the comparatively smaller, quieter domestic relocations the other 14 housekeepers had accepted. No crime, in any conventional legal sense, had ultimately been committed against any of them. They had simply vanished entirely on purpose, into new identities they had each specifically requested and negotiated as part of their own individual settlement terms. Carol explained that night, speaking quietly in the sitting room while Elena remained by the window, that Elena's condition had improved somewhat in recent years compared to where it had been immediately following the accident. She could dress herself, feed herself, and, on good days, follow simple conversation, though sustained speech remained largely beyond her. Carol had petitioned Marcus twice over the years, she told Dana, to allow at least a limited reintroduction to the outside world, supervised visits with a therapist, perhaps eventually with Margaret, given how much Elena's condition had stabilized. Both times, according to Carol, Marcus had refused, citing the same fear each time, that any reappearance, however limited, would immediately reopen every legal and public question his original deception had been built to permanently close. Dana asked Carol directly, that first night, why she herself had stayed employed at Ravenscroft Hall for as long as she had, given what the arrangement clearly cost Elena in isolation alone. Carol's answer was neither a defense nor an apology. She said simply that she had believed, in the earliest years, that she was the one person standing between Elena and a life with no dignity at all, and that somewhere along the way, watching housekeeper after housekeeper get quietly paid to disappear, she had lost track of the exact point where protecting Elena's dignity had become instead protecting Marcus's secret. She told Dana she had been waiting, without ever quite admitting it to herself, for someone to walk up that staircase and refuse to leave quietly. She said Dana was the first one who had. Elena, in the quiet, careful days that followed Dana's unexpected discovery, began, haltingly at first, with the patient help of a notepad Carol had kept beside her chair for years for exactly this kind of rare, difficult communication, to express herself in a way she had reportedly done only a handful of times in the preceding 9 years. On the second night after Dana first found her, Elena wrote 4 words on that notepad in slow, careful, deliberate handwriting, and turned it so that Dana could read them clearly. "Tell someone I'm still here." Dana Pierce was offered, within days, the same kind of settlement 14 housekeepers before her had ultimately accepted without significant resistance. By her own later account, the specific number offered to her was the largest yet presented to any departing employee in the estate's 11-year history, an amount that would have comfortably paid off every remaining debt she carried and fully funded her son Caleb's education well before he ever turned 18. She turned it down. Instead, within a single week of her discovery, Dana quietly tracked down Elena's estranged younger sister, a woman named Margaret Marchetti, who had not spoken directly to Marcus Whitfield in the 9 years since Elena's supposed death, largely because of a bitter private falling out over the handling of the original memorial service, one that Margaret herself had never fully understood or been given a satisfactory explanation for at the time. Dana told Margaret everything she had personally seen and heard inside that sealed hallway. What followed was not, as a great many people online would later argue it should have been, a dramatic criminal trial, because, and this is the single detail that would go on to frustrate a considerable portion of the public once the full story eventually broke, no North Carolina statute had been clearly and provably violated in any way prosecutors felt confident pursuing. Elena had not, in any strict legal sense, been imprisoned against her own expressed will. Medical records later reviewed in full by an independent court-appointed guardian ad litem confirmed that she had received consistently high-quality, medically appropriate care throughout the entire 9-year period, and Carol Nesbitt's own employment and licensing records showed full compliance with every relevant state healthcare regulation. What Marcus Whitfield had actually done was engineer an elaborate, expensive, and sustained deception, but deception on its own, absent clear fraud against a specific government body or a specific identifiable victim actively demanding restitution, proved to be a remarkably difficult thing for prosecutors to build a criminal case around. What followed instead was a civil guardianship proceeding, formally brought by Margaret Marchetti on her sister's behalf, which became fully public within a matter of weeks and which Marcus Whitfield, notably, chose not to contest at any stage. It was during that proceeding that the final and most significant twist in this entire story came fully to light, the single detail that would end up reframing almost everything that had come before it in the public's eyes. The extraordinary lengths taken over 11 years to silence a series of increasingly curious housekeepers, the pattern of settlements escalating steadily in both frequency and secrecy year over year, the shell company private investigator hired at one point to monitor a former employee who had relocated out of state, had not, in fact, been directed primarily by Marcus Whitfield's own personal wishes at all. Sworn depositions given during the proceeding revealed that Gerald Combs, the longtime personal attorney who had personally handled every one of the estate's 17 housekeeper departures over more than a decade, had grown increasingly convinced, largely independent of his own client's stated wishes, that any public revelation of Elena's true condition would trigger not merely a personal and reputational scandal for Marcus, but a potentially hostile guardianship claim from Elena's surviving family that could, given her documented minority ownership stake in Whitfield Logistics Group from its earliest founding years, hand Margaret and her relatives significant and unwanted influence over the company's future direction. Combs, by his own sworn admission under oath during the proceeding, had escalated the estate's secrecy measures considerably beyond anything Marcus had originally and explicitly authorized him to do, including, in at least one documented instance, quietly and falsely threatening a former housekeeper's prospective new employer with a fabricated negative reference, specifically in order to discourage that former employee from ever speaking publicly about her time at Ravenscroft Hall. Marcus Whitfield testified, under direct questioning, that he had genuinely not known the full extent of what his own longtime attorney had done in his name over the years, though he did not, at any point, dispute that he had personally authorized and had directly benefited from the underlying deception itself for the full 9 years it had been maintained. Elena Whitfield was formally placed under her sister Margaret's legal guardianship within roughly 2 months of the proceedings' conclusion. She began, shortly afterward, a structured program of reconstructive medical treatment and long-term rehabilitative care that, according to publicly available records, continues in some form to this day. Marcus Whitfield ultimately faced a substantial civil judgment in Elena's favor, along with the near-total and rapid collapse of his previously carefully guarded public reputation, but he was never formally charged with any criminal offense in connection with the case. He did not, in the end, bury a body anywhere on the grounds of Ravenscroft Hall, despite 11 years of rumor and speculation suggesting otherwise. He instead buried a living person inside the shell of her own marriage, one carefully negotiated settlement at a time, for 9 consecutive years, and when the truth of it all finally came fully into the light, the law itself had remarkably little to say about any of it. The 14 former housekeepers who had accepted settlements over the years were, notably, never asked to return any portion of the money they had received, nor were they legally compelled to break their own non-disclosure agreements once the guardianship proceeding became public. Several chose to speak anyway, in limited and carefully worded ways, once it became clear the broader truth was already out. Their accounts, taken together, filled in the remaining edges of the 11-year pattern that Dana's own 4 months at the estate had only partially revealed. None of them expressed regret at having taken the money at the time. Several expressed, in nearly identical language according to journalists who interviewed more than one of them separately, a version of the same sentiment, that they had told themselves whatever was happening upstairs was none of their business, and that the size of the check made it easier to believe that. Gerald Combs was disbarred within the year following his sworn testimony, and faced a separate civil suit of his own brought by 2 of the former housekeepers whose new employers he had contacted with fabricated references. Marcus Whitfield, for his part, gave a single public statement through representatives in the weeks after the guardianship proceeding concluded, expressing what the statement described as profound regret for the pain his decisions had caused Elena, her family, and the 17 women who had passed through his household's employment over more than a decade. He did not give the face-to-face interview many outlets requested, and as of this recording, he still has not. Dana Pierce returned to Knoxville within a month of the story becoming public, declining the vast majority of media requests that followed, though she did agree, months later, to a single lengthy interview that forms the basis for much of what you've heard in this video. When asked directly why she had turned down a settlement larger than any of the 16 women before her had been offered, her answer was simple, and it is, in many ways, the truest summary of everything that happened inside that house. She said she kept thinking about the second tray, carried up every single morning for years by a woman who had never once been allowed to explain why. And she said she could not imagine living the rest of her life knowing she had been paid to forget it. So here's the question this entire story ultimately leaves behind, and it's one genuinely worth sitting with for a moment. 16 women walked away from Ravenscroft Hall over 11 years with a settlement check and a signature, each one choosing comfortable silence over an uncomfortable truth. Only one of them, Dana Pierce, ultimately chose otherwise, fully knowing it would cost her the single largest payday of her entire life. Would you have opened that door yourself if you had been standing in Dana's place that night? And once you had, would you have quietly taken the same money everyone before you had taken, or would you have done exactly what she did instead? Were the 16 housekeepers who chose to stay quiet over the years actually guilty of anything at all, in any meaningful sense? Or were they simply doing what almost anyone might reasonably do when offered enough money to permanently change their life? Tell me honestly, in the comments below, exactly what you think you would have done in Dana's position. And if you found the story of Ravenscroft Hall difficult to believe, wait until you hear what happened in the house standing directly next door to it, where a longtime caretaker vanished during the very same week a new family first moved in, and where, unlike this story, no settlement was ever quietly offered afterward to explain exactly why. Subscribe now for more real stories.